What if the battlefield had warned them and they chose to laugh it off? At first, it didn't feel like danger. It felt like inconvenience. Birds lifting from the tree line in sudden waves, entire flocks abandoning their nests at once, the sky briefly darkened by wings moving in the same direction. Veterans noticed it. Recruits joked about it. Officers dismissed it. Birds flee all the time. Wind changes. Noise travels. War zones are chaotic by nature. No one wrote it down. No one reported it up the chain of command. And that was the first mistake. Because what those men were witnessing wasn't random behavior. It was a biological reaction to something humans couldn't yet detect. Long before radios crackled or scouts returned with reports, the environment itself had sensed a disturbance. Low-frequency vibrations, subtle pressure changes, rhythmic pulses traveling through the ground signals beneath the threshold of human perception, but impossible for animals to ignore. History shows this pattern repeating itself in war after war. Horses refusing to advance, dogs whining and pulling at their handlers, rats abandoning trenches hours before bombardments, and birds leaving first. Nature does not wait for confirmation. It reacts. But trained soldiers are taught to trust doctrine, not instinct. Manuals do not account for migrating flocks. Command structures don't impose operations because sparrows scatter. In a system built on discipline and hierarchy, intuition is treated as weakness. Observation without instruments is dismissed as superstition. So when the birds fled that morning, the moment passed. The men stayed where they were, helmets loosened, rifles rested against packs. Some even welcomed the quiet that followed, mistaking it for calm. The absence of birds created an unnatural silence, but silence in war is often interpreted as safety. No engines, no artillery, no incoming fire, just still air and open ground. What no one realized was that silence itself was the warning. Beneath their boots, the earth was already responding. Tiny oscillations rippled through soil and stones, too weak to feel, but strong enough to carry intent. Somewhere out of sight, something massive was moving with purpose. Not charging, not rushing, advancing methodically, generating pressure that spread outward like a pulse. Modern sensors would later be designed to detect exactly this kind of vibration. Seismic microphones, ground radar, acoustic arrays. But at that moment in history, the only early warning system available was alive, and it had already evacuated the area. This is the cruel irony of many military disasters. The information was there, visible and undeniable, but it didn't arrive in a format commanders respected. It didn't come through a scope or a headset. It arrived through instinct and behavior, through patterns humans had long ago stopped paying attention to. Some soldiers felt it, though they couldn't explain it. A tightening, the chest, an urge to move, a sense that the ground itself felt wrong. Those sensations were ignored, overridden by routine. Orders had not changed. No alarms had sounded, and so discipline prevailed over doubt. Minutes later, men would swear they felt the vibration begin almost gently, like distant thunder. But by then, the moment to act had already passed. The birds had been right. They always are. Before this story goes any further, there's something important you need to do. If you're still watching right now, it means you understand that history isn't just about dates and battles. It's about signals, decisions, and the moments when ignoring a warning changes everything. That's exactly why your engagement matters here. Take a moment and leave a comment telling us what you think those soldiers should have done when the birds fled. Should instinct ever override doctrine in war? Or is discipline always the safer choice? Write your answer below. Even a single sentence helps this conversation stay alive. If this story is already making you see military history differently, hit the like button. That simple action tells the algorithm that deep research stories like this deserve to reach more people who care about real history, not surface-level summaries. And if you want more stories about hidden warning signs, forgotten tactics, and moments that changed wars before anyone realized it, make sure you subscribe to the channel. New videos like this are coming, and you won't want to miss what happens next in this one. The silence didn't arrive steadily. It settled in. At first, it felt almost welcome. After days of constant noise-distant artillery, engines shouted orders. The absence of sound created the illusion of control. No incoming fire, no visible movement, no immediate threat. For exhausted soldiers, silence can feel like permission to breathe. But this silence was different. Men who had survived previous engagements noticed it instinctively. Not consciously, not in a way they could easily articulate, but as a subtle disturbance in their internal rhythm. The air felt heavier. The background noise of live birds, insects, distant animal movement had vanished all at once. It wasn't quiet the way dawn is quiet. It was empty. In military history, silence is rarely neutral. It can signal retreat. It can signal preparation. Or worse, it can signal that something has already begun moving beyond visual range. Yet doctrine trains soldiers to interpret danger through recognizable indicators. Enemy formations, Haju intercepts, muzzle flashes, dust trails. Silence is not one of them. So the absence of sound was categorized as irrelevant. The men adjusted their gear. Some sat. Others leaned against equipment. Conversations resumed in low tones. A few laughed, making jokes about how even the wildlife knew better than to stick around a war zone. That joke would not age well. What they didn't realize was that silence wasn't the absence of activity. It was the absence of warning noise. The natural world had already cleared the area. There would be no fluttering wings to mark sudden movement, no startled animals to draw attention. The battlefield had been stripped of its early alert layer. This is a recurring blind spot in modern warfare. As technology advances, reliance on instruments replaces reliance on observation. The more sophisticated the equipment, the less trust is placed in human perception. Soldiers are trained to wait for confirmation, for orders, for data that fits within known parameters, but not every threat announces itself in recognizable ways. In several historical conflicts, survivors later describe moments like this with striking similarity: a pause that felt too clean, an unnatural stillness that made time feel stretched, the sensation that something massive was approaching without any visual confirmation to justify the fear. Those who acted on that feeling often survived. Those who dismissed it rarely did. In this case, the silence hid movement. Not fast movement, not chaotic movement, but coordinated, deliberate advance. The kind that generates pressure waves through the ground rather than noise through the air. The kind designed to avoid detection until the last possible moment. Some soldiers would later say they remembered the exact second the silence became unbearable. The moment their minds tried to rationalize discomfort into calm, that psychological transition. Unease is mentally reclassified as safety, as where disasters often begin. Commanders, operating within rigid structures, interpreted to quiet as confirmation that no enemy action was imminent. Patrols were not redeployed. Positions were not adjusted. No contingency plans were activated. The silence was treated as evidence. In reality, it was camouflage. Military planners would later study this phenomenon under different names: sensory deprivation, false calm, pre-engagement, lull. But by in that moment, it had no label. It was simply the space between warning and impact. Long before armies invented sensors, satellites, or seismic detectors, war had already been announcing itself through nature. Animals do not need intelligence briefings. They do not wait for confirmation. Their survival depends on reacting to changes humans are trained to ignore. Pressure shifts, subaudible vibrations, rhythmic disturbances traveling through soil, stone, and air. These signals register instantly in nervous systems evolved for detection, not interpretation. Throughout military history, this pattern has appeared again and again, often recognized only after catastrophe. In ancient campaigns, war elephants refused to advance hours before ambush. Roman chroniclers described horses panicking without visible cause before enemy maneuvers. In trenched warfare, rats abandoned sections of the line shortly before artillery barrages, fleeing deep vibrations carried through packed earth long before shells arrive. In naval warfare, seabirds lifted en masse before underwater detonations or submarine activity disturbed pressure layers beneath the surface. These were not coincidences. They were early warnings. What animals detect first is not sound, but movement translated into vibration. Heavy equipment rolling underground, coordinated marching forces, mechanized systems displacing soil or air at regular intervals. Even human heartbeats can be sensed by certain species at close range. Multiply that sensitivity across thousands of tons of moving mass, and the signal becomes unmistakable. But modern military culture evolved to distrust what cannot be measured. As warfare industrialized, instinct was replaced with instrumentation. Observation gave way to data. A threat that could not be seen, heard, or quantified was considered non-existent. This created a dangerous gap one, where nature could scream warnings, while command structures heard nothing at all. In the moments leading up to disaster, nature often reacts first because it cannot afford delay. Birds flee not because they understand danger, but because their bodies interpret the environment as suddenly hostile. Trees do not warn. The ground does not speak, but life responds. And when life withdraws, it leaves behind a vacuum that should never be ignored. Military after-action reports from multiple conflicts contain eerily similar survivor statements. The animals disappeared. The dogs wouldn't stop whining. Even the insects went quiet. These details were usually written off as stress-induced memory distortions, but when patterns repeat across eras, continents, and technologies, coincidence becomes explanation. The problem is not that soldiers failed to notice. Many did. The problem is that noticing carried no authority. There was no protocol for responding to mass animal flight. No line in the manual that said, if the birds leave, reposition immediately. And without institutional permission, instinct becomes insubordination. So warnings were internalized, suppressed, and forgotten. What made this particular moment especially lethal was the nature of the threat itself. It wasn't explosive, at least not yet. It wasn't airborne. It wasn't visible on the horizon. It was moving through the environment in a way only non-human systems could immediately perceive. The birds weren't reacting to fear. They were reacting to physics, pressure, frequency, repetition. The ground was being disturbed in a pattern that did not belong to nature, and nature recognized the difference instantly. Only later would military science catch up, developing equipment designed to replicate what animals had always done naturally. Seismic sensors to detect tunneling, ground-penetrating radar, acoustic arrays tuned to low-frequency movement. Entire branches of modern warfare now exist to interpret the exact signals that birds responded to instinctively. But on that day, none of that existed. All that existed was a warning that arrived too early in the wrong language and through messengers no one was trained to trust. And as history would prove once again, when early warnings are ignored, the consequences do not arrive gradually. They arrive all at once. Doctrine exists for a reason. It creates order out of chaos, discipline out of fear, predictability out of panic. In most situations, doctrine saves lives. But when doctrine becomes infallible, when it refuses to acknowledge reality, outside its own rules, it turns from protection into liability. That was exactly what happened here. The officers on the ground were not careless. They were doing precisely what they had been trained to do. Follow established procedures, trust confirmed intelligence, and ignore variables that could not be verified. In military systems built for large-scale coordination, deviation is dangerous. A single false alarm can trigger panic, waste resources, or expose positions unnecessarily. So, doctrine teaches restraint. The problem is that doctrine is always written for the last war, not the next one. In this case, doctrine had no category for environmental anomalies, no checklist item for mass animal evacuation, no decision tree for unexplained silence. If a threat did not present itself through no indicators, enemy sightings, radio intercepts, artillery signatures, it effectively did not exist. Several junior officers reportedly raised concerns, not formally, quietly. Comments like, "This feels off," or "I don't like how quiet it is." These were not actionable statements. They lacked evidence. They could not be escalated without risking credibility. In rigid hierarchies, uncertainty without data is treated as noise, and noise is filtered out. This filtering effect is one of the most dangerous features of bureaucratic warfare. Information that does not fit predefined models is systematically discarded, even when it is accurate. Desisting favors consistency over adaptability because consistency is easier to manage at scale. As a result, subtle warnings are often recognized only in hindsight. In multiple historical disasters, ambushes, tunnel assaults, subterranean attacks, the same pattern emerges. Early signals appear. They are noticed by individuals. Those individuals hesitate to act without authorization. Authorization never comes. The event unfolds exactly as the warning predicted. What makes this moment especially tragic is that the cost of acting would have been minimal. A temporary repositioning, increased spacing, a shift in posture, even heightened alertness would have changed the outcome. But doctrine did not allow for precaution without confirmation. Confirmation, by definition, arrives too late. Rigid doctrine also creates a psychological trap. Once procedures are followed correctly, responsibility feels transferred upward. Soldiers and officers alike become reassured not by safety, but by compliance. If something goes, at least it was done by the book. That mindset reduces personal accountability, but it also reduces initiative. And initiative is the first casualty when facing unconventional threats. The enemy understood this. Their strategy relied on predictability, not just of movement, but of thought. They knew how Western command structures operated. They knew signals would be ignored unless validated by instruments. They exploited the gap between human intuition and institutional response. This was not just a tactical failure, it was a cognitive one. When the ground began to transmit irregular vibrations too faint to feel, too consistent to be natural with a warning existed in a space doctrine could not process. It was neither visible nor audible. It could not be triangulated or logged, so it was dismissed by default. And yet, beneath the surface, the situation was already irreversible. History shows that the most dangerous enemy is not the one with superior firepower, but the one who understands how you think. In this case, the attackers did not need to defeat defenses directly. They simply needed to move in a way that defenses were trained not to recognize. By the time doctrine would finally acknowledge the threat, it would be because the threat had already surfaced. Literally, at first, no one reacted. The sensation was so subtle, it barely registered less a shock, more a suggestion, a faint vibration that traveled upward through boots and into bones, easy to mistake for distant artillery or heavy vehicles miles away. In war, the ground is never completely still. Tremors happen, explosions echo, engines rumble beyond the horizon. The human mind is trained to normalize these sensations, to file them away as background noise. So when the earth stirred, men paused but did not move. A few glanced at each other, silently asking the same question without speaking it. Did you feel that? No alarms sounded. No radio traffic changed. No visible dust clouds rose in the distance. The tremor passed, leaving behind nothing but uncertainty. Then it happened again, this time stronger, not violent, but rhythmic. A pulsing vibration, repeating at regular intervals, too consistent to be random. Some soldiers felt it in their knees, others in their teeth. Equipment lightly rattled. Loose stones shifted against metal. Still, there was hesitation. The sensation didn't match known patterns. It didn't feel like incoming fire. It didn't feel like an earthquake. It felt intentional. Moments like this expose the limits of human perception under stress. The brain seeks familiar explanations first. Distant artillery, friendly armor repositioning, training exercises gone unnoticed, anything that preserves the assumption of control. Accepting an unknown explanation requires abandoning predictability, and predictability is comforting even when it's wrong. Officers scanned the horizon. Nothing. The vibration returned, deeper now, resonating through the ground, in waves that grew closer together. Some men crouched instinctively, hands tightening on rifles. Others froze, waiting for orders that did not come. This was not how attacks were supposed to begin. And that was the problem. The ground was no longer just transmitting movement. It was amplifying it. Each pulse traveled outward, bouncing through soil and rock, merging into a low-frequency hum that pressed against the body. Breathing felt heavier. The sensation of pressure increased, not from above, but from below. That was when panic began to surface. Not loud panic, not shouting or running. The quiet kind, the kind that spreads through eye contact and body language. A tightening of posture, a shift in stance, men repositioning without instruction. The realization, dawning too late, that something fundamental had been misunderstood. The vibration wasn't approaching from a distance. It was already underneath them. Actually, that moment, doctrine collapsed. Training offered no guidance. There was no formation for what was happening, no defensive maneuver for an enemy that did not appear on the surface. Radios crackled as officers demanded clarification. Reports came in fragmented and confused. Ground movement, possible underground activity, unclear source. By the time the words were spoken, the signal had become undeniable. The earth convulsed, not violently at first, but decisively. Soil cracked, dust burst upward in narrow columns, small fissures formed, then widened. Men stumbled as the ground shifted beneath them. The battlefield transformed from solid footing into unstable terrain in seconds. Whatever had been moving below was no longer content to remain hidden. This was the exact moment the birds had fled for. What followed would unfold faster than command structures could adapt, faster than warnings could be issued, faster than anyone could escape. The tremor had crossed the threshold from signal to action, and once that threshold is crossed, survival becomes a matter of seconds, not strategy. The first rupture didn't look like an attack. It looked like the ground giving up. Soil collapsed inward, not outward. No explosion, no fireball. Just a sudden absence where solid earth had been a moment before. Men instinctively stepped back, trying to make sense of what they were seeing, as if the terrain itself had malformed. Then another section gave way, and another. This wasn't chaos. It was precision. What had been moving beneath them was not a natural force and not a single device. It was a coordinated system engineered, timed, and executed to exploit the one domain most defenses ignored: the space below the battlefield. The vibrations weren't a side effect. They were the byproduct of controlled movement, of machinery and manpower operating in confined underground corridors, advancing in parallel lines. This was subterranean warfare, weaponized. For centuries, tunneling had existed as a siege tactic. Medieval armies dug beneath walls. Miners collapsed foundations. But what was happening here was different in scale and intent. These were not crude shafts. They were reinforced passageways, calculated to withstand pressure and conceal sound, built to place force exactly where it would cause maximum disruption. The enemy wasn't trying to breach a wall. They were undermining certainty. As the ground continued to fracture, concealed access points opened in rapid sequence, not randomly, but according to a geometry. Each collapse exposed another opening, another emergence point, creating confusion about where the true threat was concentrated. Defensive positions suddenly found themselves surrounded not horizontally, but vertically. This is the nightmare scenario for any ground force. Traditional defenses are oriented outward. Fields of fire lines of sight, obstacles designed to slow visible movement. None of them function when the enemy bypasses the surface entirely. From below, there is no warning shot, no gradual escalation, only sudden proximity. What made this tactic especially devastating was its psychological effect. Soldiers are trained to face danger. They are not trained to have it rise beneath their feet. The instinct to retreat becomes meaningless when every step might collapse. The ground, the one constant in combat, had become unreliable. Reports later confirmed that the attackers used synchronized mechanical drives and manual excavation teams working in rotation, allowing continuous forward movement without rest. The rhythm of the vibrations matched this cycle perfectly. Push, pause, reinforce, advance again. That rhythm was what the birds detected first. By the time defenders understood what was happening, the underground network had already placed hostile elements directly beneath critical positions. Communication lines, supply nodes, commands postal, targeted not because they were visible, but because they were predictable. Predictability is the currency of underground warfare. Once a force commits to static positions, once routines are established, underground attackers can map behavior with frightening accuracy. They don't need aerial reconnaissance. They listen. They feel. They measure vibration patterns over time. They learn when men move, when machines run, when silence falls. And then they strike at the moment of maximum vulnerability. As sections of ground collapsed, it became clear this was not an improvised tactic. It was the culmination of weeks, perhaps months of preparation. A patient strategy designed to remain invisible until it was unstoppable. The enemy had not rushed. They had waited, letting doctrine, routine, and complacency do most of the work for them. The real weapon wasn't the tunnels. It was the assumption that the battlefield ended at the surface. And now that assumption was gone, the moment the ground betrayed them, time fractured. Orders were shouted, but not heard. Radios screamed, but not understood. Men reacted on instinct, not coordination, because coordination requires reference points. Those reference points were collapsing. The battlefield no longer had a stable shape. Every step felt provisional, every position temporary. This is where battles are truly lost. Not when the enemy fires, but when the system meant to respond stops functioning as a system. Officers attempted to reassert control, calling for perimeter adjustments, fallback lines, countermeasures that assumed the threat was still external. Those orders made sense on paper. In reality, they sent men directly toward unstable ground and emerging access points they could not see. Units moved in opposing directions, some advancing, others retreating, creating intersections of confusion that cost precious seconds. Seconds they did not have. Soldiers reported figures appearing where there should have been solid earth moments earlier, shapes rising through dust and debris, disoriented at first, then moving with rehearsed precision. The attackers did not rush. They did not shout. They moved as if they already knew exactly where to go. That calm was terrifying. Training emphasizes speed under fire, but not decision-making in a collapsing environment. There was no doctrine for vertical encirclement, no playbook for an enemy emerging simultaneously from multiple subterranean points. As a result, individual initiative filled the void, but initiative without shared understanding fragments of force. Some soldiers fired blindly into openings. Others froze, unwilling to commit without orders. A few attempted to regroup around command elements, only to discover those positions were already compromised. Communications failed as cables snapped and equipment fell into fissures. And still, the ground continued to move. The most catastrophic decisions were not made out of cowardice or incompetence, but out of partial information. One unit, believing the threat was concentrated in a single area, surged. To war, it only to trigger secondary collapses. Another, abandoned a defensible position to relocate, unaware that the attackers were using that exact movement pattern to anticipate escape routes. The enemy had studied behavior. They knew how long it took for confusion to peak. They knew when panic would override discipline. Their timing was built around the moment when command authority fractured and survival instincts took over. That was when they advanced fastest. Later, analyses would show that many casualties occurred not during initial contact, but during these transitional seconds, moments when men were moving, exposed, trying to adapt to a threat they did not fully understand. Static positions became death traps. Movement became equally dangerous. There was no safe choice, suddenly choices. This is the cruel reality of unconventional warfare. The most damage is inflicted not by firepower, but by forcing the enemy to make decisions faster than they can process information. When understanding lags behind action, mistakes multiply. By the time clarity began to emerge, by the time it became obvious this was a coordinated underground assault, it was already too late to stop it. The network beneath them had done its work. Defensive lines no longer existed as lines, only as isolated fragments. And in war, isolation is fatal. By the time understanding caught up, the battlefield had already closed around them. What had once been open ground was now a fractured landscape of collapsed soil, exposed cavities, and unstable footing. Movement slowed to instinctive caution, but caution no longer provided safety. Every delay allowed the attackers to reposition. Every attempt to regroup revealed new points of vulnerability. This is the moment where reaction becomes irrelevant. Defensive fire was sporadic, unfocused. Targets appeared briefly, then vanished back into the earth or behind debris. The attackers controlled visibility, choosing when and where to emerge. They did not need to overwhelm the defenders with numbers. They only needed to deny them coherence. Several units attempted withdrawal. That decision came too late. Escape routes that had existed minutes earlier were now compromised. Some collapsed entirely. Others funneled men into predictable paths that had already been mapped from below. The ground itself guided movement often in the worst possible direction. Attempts to establish new defensive perimeters failed as the concept of a perimeter lost, meaning you cannot draw a line against an enemy who ignores horizontal space. Commanders, now fully aware of the threat, issued urgent orders. Disengage, fall back, break contact, but contact had never been broken. It had simply shifted planes. The enemy was no longer approaching. They were already among them, rising where resistance was weakest. The psychological weight of that realization was crushing. Survivors would later describe the sensation of being hunted from below as uniquely paralyzing. There is no horizon to watch, no direction to focus on. Every shadow, every depression in the ground becomes a potential emergence point. Even standing still feels dangerous. The stage casualties mounted rapidly, not because of overwhelming firepower, but because of cascading failure. Units lost cohesion. Medics could not reach the wounded. Evacuation became impossible. Leadership was reduced to local, improvised authority as formal command structures dissolved. The attackers exploited this expertly. They did not pursue fleeing soldiers aggressively. They let terrain and confusion do the work. Pressure was applied selectively, forcing movement into areas already compromised. Each reaction triggered another collapse, another exposure. It was a battle fought against inevitability. This is the moment history often compresses into a single sentence. The position was overrun, But that phrase hides the reality. What actually happens is slower, more suffocating. Men realize they are reacting instead of acting, that every choice narrows their options further, that survival is no longer a matter of skill or courage, but of timing and luck. By the time the final countermeasures were considered, by the time commanders fully grasped the scale of the underground network, the window to disrupt it had closed. The infrastructure below was already too extensive, too well positioned. The warning signs had come early. The birds, the silence, the vibrations, but response had come late. And in warfare, lateness is indistinguishable from defeat. The battle ended long before its consequences did. What unfolded on that ground did not remain a localized failure or a tragic anomaly to be quietly filed away. Within days, fragments of reports began moving up the chain of command, confused at first, contradictory, stripped of emotion, and reduced to sterile language. Unexpected subterranean activity, loss of positional integrity, failure of early warning indicators. But behind those phrases was a realization that unsettled planners far from the battlefield. This was not just a tactical defeat. It was a structural exposure. For decades, military strategy had been built around dominance of three domains: land, air, and sea. Every doctrine, every sensor, every defensive system was designed to control space that could be seen, mapped, and targeted. What this event revealed was a fourth domain that had been dangerously underestimated, not as terrain, but as a weaponized environment. The underground was no longer just concealment. It was maneuver space. Strategists quickly understood the implications. Static defenses were suddenly liabilities. Fortifications, supply hubs, command centers, anything fixed in place, became predictable targets, not from above, but from below. The very act of holding ground created vulnerability. Movement patterns, routines, even rest cycles could be studied through vibration and pressure analysis. In other words, the battlefield had become transparent, just not in the way anyone had prepared for. This forced an uncomfortable reassessment of how security was defined. Early warning systems that relied on visual reconnaissance or acoustic detection were insufficient. Intelligence cycles were too slow. By the time confirmation arrived, the decisive phase was already over. The enemy did not need superior numbers or fire. They needed patience and an understanding of how institutional thinking worked. The shock rippled outward. Training manuals were quietly rewritten. Engineering units were expanded. Entire research programs were launched to study ground resonance, subsurface acoustics, and vibration-based detection. Seismic sensors, once limited to geological research, began appearing in military doctrine. Patrol patterns were altered, static deployments reconsidered, but adaptation lagged behind reality. The deeper impact was psychological. Commanders who had spent their careers mastering surface warfare were forced to confront a battlefield that punished predictability, a domain where superiority could not be asserted through visibility or presence, where absence was an advantage, where the enemy could prepare for months without ever being seen. This single event accelerated a shift in strategic thinking that would surface years later in conflicts across different continents. Tunnel networks, subterranean logistics, underground command centers, warfare that moved beneath cities, borders, and fortifications, rendering traditional concepts of front lines obsolete. In hindsight, analysts would identify this moment as a warning shot, not just about tunnels, but about complacency, about what happens when doctrine hardens faster than the environment changes, about how enemies adapt not by matching strength, but by attacking blind spots. And the most disturbing conclusion of all was this: the warning signs had been obvious, not to machines, not to command structures, but to nature. The battlefield had spoken early. Only now, after the damage was done, was anyone listening. Long after the ground settled and the reports were finalized, one question lingered in every serious analysis of the event: how could so many warnings be missed? The answer was uncomfortable, because it had nothing to do with intelligence gaps or technological failure. The information had been there from the beginning. It simply arrived in a form the system was not built to respect. Military institutions are designed to value clarity over ambiguity, confirmation over intuition, instruments over instincts. That structure works until the battlefield changes faster than doctrine can adapt. In this case, the warning signs were not hidden. They were visible, audible, and measurable to living systems long before they registered on human frameworks of threat detection. Birds fleeing, silence spreading unnaturally, rhythmic ground disturbances. Each signal alone could be dismissed. Together, they formed a pattern that required interpretation rather than validation. That distinction matters. Modern warfare increasingly favors environments where traditional indicators fail: density terrain, urban centers, underground networks, hybrid tactics that blur the line between preparation and attack. In these environments, the earliest warnings rarely arrive as clear data points. They arrive as anomalies, deviations, things that feel wrong before they can be proven wrong. The lesson, then, was not about tunnels or vibrations alone. It was about perception. After this event, military planners began discussing a concept that had long been considered unreliable: contextual awareness beyond instrumentation, not replacing sensors but complementing them, teaching soldiers and commanders to recognize environmental cues as data, not superstition, to treat silence, animal behavior, and terrain response as potential indicators rather than background noise. But those discussions came too late for the men on that ground. For them, the cost of ignoring unconventional signals was immediate and irreversible. Once the first collapse occurred, every subsequent decision was reactive. Once reaction replaced anticipation, control was lost. And once control was lost, the outcome was inevitable. History is full of moments like this where the difference between survival and catastrophe was not firepower but attention, not strength but humility. The humility to accept that humans do not perceive the world as completely as they believe they do. Nature had detected the threat early. Doctrine had dismissed it, and the ground delivered the final verdict. If you've made it all the way to the end of this story, you're not just watching history, you're thinking about it. Take a moment right now and leave a comment with this exact phrase: the signs were always there. It tells me you understood the deeper lesson behind this event. Not just what happened, but why it happened. If this story changed the way you see military history, if it made you realize how often disasters begin with ignored warnings, then hit the like button. That one action helps stories like this reach people who actually value deep, researched history instead of surface-level narratives. And if you want more videos uncovering hidden signals, forgotten tactics, and moments where a single decision reshaped entire wars, make sure to subscribe to the channel. The next video appearing on your screen continues this theme. Another moment where the outcome was decided long before the first shot was fired. Thanks for being here. Thanks for staying until the end. And I'll see you in the next story.